But I do want to take it back on this episode to an essential foundational principle of the American Revolution that Otis was actually getting at in that quote, "An act against the Constitution is void." It's pointing out that government does not have the final say over itself. It's about sovereignty. And we're told over and over and over, if you just go to the government-run schools, that the revolution, which led to the War for Independence, I mean, they often conflate those two, but the revolution was just about needing representatives to tax the people, or suspending legislatures, or blocking ports, or sometimes once in a while you'll hear that the shooting war in April of 1775 started because of a gun control program, but these were all, to the founders, to the old revolutionaries, really just an outgrowth of one of the most important and major claims to almost unlimited power, something known as the Declaratory Act, which I've mentioned in this show a number of times, but we'll go into a little bit more detail here today. And Mike Meharry, in an article that we just published last Friday, said in early 1766, the colonists effectively nullified the Stamp Act, forcing the Parliament to repeal the hated law. There was a combination of resistance and non-compliance by the people. Even some local sheriffs didn't participate in enforcement. We know that there were resolutions at the legislative level, at the legislative assembly level, and even there was a court in Maryland that struck it down as unconstitutional and against the law, and no one was bound to obey it. We saw all kinds of stuff, and that kind of combination of resistance and opposition and non-compliance at various levels really made the law unenforceable. And I think it was more of a political decision by Parliament. They knew that they were in trouble, and if they didn't actually repeal it, they were going to have a big problem on their hands. But as Mike Meharry points out, there was a caveat with that repeal. It was a slap in the face. It was a backhanded repeal, in essence. And he writes that at the same time, Parliament also passed what was known as the Declaratory Act, asserting that it could make laws binding the American colonies, quote, in all cases whatsoever. So at the same time, they're saying, okay, we're gonna get rid of this, but we don't want you guys to think that we are giving up on this idea of internal taxation. We can make laws binding on you no matter what, in every situation whatsoever, in all cases whatsoever. And the act was actually called an Act for the better securing the dependency of His Majesty's dominions in America upon the Crown and Parliament of Great Britain. If you ever watched my favorite movie, which is probably today, V for Vendetta, it rotates. But there was one scene in there where the people were getting out of hand, and the Chancellor Sutler, decided, hey, he's having a meeting of his team. Of course, he's in some hidden bunker, and he's over on his big telescreen yelling at them. He says, we need to remind these people why they need us. And that's what government has done for, well, forever. Anyways, that was a quick aside. But here from the Declaratory Act, not only did they claim the power, they put in statute that they had power over the colonies in all cases whatsoever. But they added this, and I've never really covered this on any other episode, where they actually say that even merely opposing them, any acts that oppose this type of power is null and void, doesn't count. And here's how it is. This is right from the text of the legislation. And it be it further declared and enacted by the authority aforesaid, that all resolutions, votes, orders, and proceedings in any of the said colonies or plantations, whereby the power and authority of the Parliament of Great Britain to make laws and statutes as aforesaid, in all cases whatsoever, is denied or drawn into question, are and are hereby declared to be utterly null and void to all in purposes whatsoever. So even just calling into question their unlimited power in all cases whatsoever meant that the proceeding, the petition, whatever, it just doesn't count. It is void in all, null and void in all situations. This is like a reverse nullification from what we're used to. And Meharry puts it this way. He says, in essence, it was a claim of absolute and unlimited centralized authority. This is about sovereignty, or who has final authority in any country, in any system of government, in any society. And Meharry points out that in the British system, the king in Parliament, that was the technical term, the king in Parliament was considered sovereign. And in effect, Parliament wielded final authority, with the king serving as the arm to put its power into action. And Massachusetts Royal Governor Sir Francis Bernard went as far as this, to put it this way, in 1764. This is before the Declaratory Act, so they already were holding this position that they had total sovereignty in all situations. And this will be linked to in the show notes along with everything else, but here's how Bernard put it. The king in Parliament has the sole right of legislation and the supreme superintendency of the government. And in this plenitude of power, he's absolute, uncontrollable, and accountable to none. And therefore, in a political sense, can do no wrong. And in essence, the way I see it, this is very similar to what we live under today. Although we do have a written constitution and we tell in that written constitution, the government has limits. But ultimately, the way that people treat the Constitution is no different than how they treated the unwritten Constitution in Britain prior to the American Revolution. Now, of course, there was a change in how they thought of that over time. I'm going to be going into that in a little bit more detail here as well. But if you're letting government decide if government violated the rules given to government by the people of the states, then government basically can make no error. The only error that government can make is if government decides if government made the error. And that is in practice no different than the king in Parliament, because the king in Parliament was able to pass this, what they called the Unconstitutional Stamp Act. And the only way that it was gotten rid of is if the government decided it was a bad choice and then at the same time said, well, we still have the power to do this. We're just deciding to get rid of it. And in fact, when they were ramping up to do this, I can't remember the exact date, but it was in spring of 1766 that they decided to repeal the Stamp Act in the face of so much resistance and protest. They actually brought in Benjamin Franklin in the Committee of the Whole of the House of Commons, February 13, 1766, and they asked him, hey, strategically, what's going on? If we can do some things, can we kind of quell this? Can we bring the tone down here? What's going to happen? And listen to these questions. Benjamin Franklin was definitely on the wrong side on this, but over time, I think he learned that it was a mistake. They asked him, considering the resolutions of Parliament as to the right, do you think if the Stamp Act is repealed that the North Americans will be satisfied? So they had a resolution passed that had this same claim to power in all cases whatsoever, and then they included it as a statute in the Declaratory Act. Franklin said, I believe they will. They'll be okay if you pass that claiming power in all cases whatsoever, as long as you repeal the Stamp Act at the same time. And they asked why. And he said, I think the resolution of right, that is, establishing their power in all cases whatsoever, will give them very little concern if they are never attempted to be carried into practice. The colonies will probably consider themselves in the same situation in that respect with Ireland. There was a declaratory act against the Irish. I can't remember if it was 17, 18, 19, or 20, but it was the same type of power. But they didn't really use it very often. And I think the issue really gets down to, at least for me and from most of the founding generation of the old revolutionaries that I read, it was really about establishing a precedent. If you establish the precedent that they can use a power, then eventually they will. And even if you can go through a long period where they don't, if they have that power on the books, someone is going to come along and find it and use it in pretty crazy ways. And anyways, Benjamin Franklin says they'll consider it as similar to Ireland, but we know that they didn't really use it too often against Ireland. They said they know that you claim the same right with regard to Ireland, but you never exercise it. And they may believe you never will exercise it in the colonies any more than in Ireland, unless on some very extraordinary occasion. So at first, Benjamin Franklin is represented, and this is probably his view, but this was actually a relatively common view from my understanding of the history, that because they got such a big W by nullifying the Stamp Act, people were celebrating, and they knew that this type of thing was on the books against the Irish, and it wasn't really used, and maybe, as Franklin said, it was never used up until that point, over a period of decades. They're like, okay, they're just trying to save face and look cool. As long as we got rid of the Stamp Act, everything, it was fine. So there wasn't really a big outcry at first. They saw it primarily as a paper tiger. But there were some that were concerned about it right off the bat. And John Adams here in his diary of April 26, 1766, probably just weeks after it was passed, he points out that the first resolve is that the king, lords, and commons have an undoubted right to make laws for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. I am solicitous to know whether they will lay a tax in consequence of that resolution or what kind of law they will make. So John Adams, for example, especially when he was one of the good guys early on, he saw this and recognized, well, how are they going to use this? It's not just like Benjamin Franklin was saying in the House of Commons, no one is expecting to use it. We know already that it was more of a minority, but John Adams was one who was pointing that out. And we know that less than 15 months later than this, at the instigation of Charles Townshend, they certainly did attempt to carry it into practice. This is the Townshend Acts of 1767. And we know the rest from there is often, well, they call it history. The rest is history. So this closely tracked at this time, 1765 and so on, a very radical change in the viewpoints of the people. John Adams said this was the real American Revolution, that radical change in the viewpoints of the people from 1760 or so through 1775, before the War for Independence. And Meharry puts it this way: influenced by the writings of John Locke, Algernon Sidney, and other thinkers, the founders and old revolutionaries began to form a very different conception of government. They came to believe that the people are sovereign and government is constrained by their will. So we have two conflicting views. One developing that the people are sovereign and that through a constitution, government is only allowed to do certain things. At that point, of course, it was on the unwritten British Constitution, but there were certain limits. It was very gray area, of course, but there were certain limits and government couldn't go beyond that. But the government people, as government people always do, felt that, well, the government people decide if the government people violated the rules, or some part of the government tells the other part of the government, and ultimately they have the final say over everything. And Mike says, in other words, this was a controversy brewing about sovereignty and who has ultimate and final authority. Two groups of people holding such radically divergent views of sovereignty were bound to clash. And at first, they weren't going crazy about the Declaratory Act. There were some warnings, but soon as they implemented or tried to implement the Townshend Act, another version of a tax, a smaller one, then all of a sudden people start pointing to the Declaratory Act as a problem. And John Dickinson, in his Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, of course, these are the most widely read documents on American liberty up until publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense in 1776. If you want to get a great understanding of the viewpoints of the Revolutionary period, especially in the 1760s, John Dickinson's letters are really the place to start. And here's how he put it in letter number 8. He said, "No man who considers the conduct of the Parliament since the repeal of the Stamp Act and the disposition of many people at home can doubt that the chief object of attention there is, to use Mr. Greenville's expression, providing that the dependence and obedience of the colonies be asserted and maintained." And they knew that the dude who was responsible for getting the Declaratory Act pushed into law, that was the goal of it, to get dependence and obedience of the colonies. They don't like it when people stand up and say, you're violating my rights. And that's the same way we see things today. Anytime you want to assert yourselves, you basically have to get permission from the central authority, from the federal government or the federal courts, to say whether or not what you're doing is your choice. Anyways, Dickinson continues, under the influence of this notion, this idea of keeping the colonies under dependence and obedience, instantly on repealing the Stamp Act, an act was passed declaring the power of Parliament to bind these colonies in all cases whatever. And he's pointing out, like, look, and now they are using this with the Townshend Acts. That's in 1767. We see John Adams starting to recognize this as well, going through 1772. And he said, if kings, lords, and commons can make laws to bind us in all cases whatsoever, the people here will have no influence, no check, no power, no control, no negative. So you are under total control of an outside entity. And for them, the taxation without representation was a part of that, because if you're going to claim power over us and we can't even have any say in what that power is, that's double bad. And Joseph Warren, Dr. Joseph Warren, he's one of the most important Revolutionary War heroes. We don't talk about him very much, but he worked with the Sons of Liberty quite a bit in Boston. He was very close with Samuel Adams. And here in November of 1772, they passed at the Boston town meeting, they passed a couple of things, one written by Samuel Adams primarily, the rights of the colonists. And then here, Joseph Warren, kind of a precursor to the so-called grievances in the Declaration of Independence, or the list of injuries and usurpations, as Thomas Jefferson put it in that document. Here we are in 1772, a list of infringements and violations of rights. So they're going through all the problems. 1772, we've got some issues happening, especially in Boston at that point, ramping up to the Boston Tea Party and the coercive acts. Things are just getting worse and worse and worse. Parliament wants to assert authority. The people don't go along with the taxes because they're unconstitutional, so Parliament tries another version. The people resist, so Parliament ramps it up, sends a standing army, blockades, over and over and over. It keeps going like that. So we have this early list of infringements and violations of rights drafted by Joseph Warren and passed in November of 1772 in Boston. We cannot help thinking that an enumeration of some of the most open infringements of our rights will by every candid person be judged sufficient to justify whatever measures have already been taken or may be thought proper to be taken in order to obtain a redress of the grievances under which we labor. So let's point out what's going on. We're still just trying. We're pointing out this is a problem. First, the British Parliament have assumed the powers of legislation for the colonists in all cases whatsoever, without obtaining the consent of the inhabitants, which is ever essentially necessary to the rightful establishment of such a legislature. So they weren't even going so far as to question the idea that a legislature could have unlimited power. They're just saying, if there is going to be unlimited power, we at least got to have a say. But they were recognizing first that this unlimited power was the number one problem, and then everything else was an outgrowth of it. So if you look at things today, if the federal government is supreme in all cases whatsoever, if federal law is always supreme, as people falsely claim it is, rather than being supreme just in pursuance of the delegated powers of the Constitution, there really is not much difference on the ground to what the old revolutionaries really took a stand against and then eventually fought a long, bloody war to free themselves from. So number two, they have exerted that assumed power, in all cases whatsoever, in raising a revenue in the colonies without their consent. So a list of infringements from the Sons of Liberty in Boston, drafted by Joseph Warren, supported by Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and so many others. The number one thing is the Declaratory Act in 1772, and everything else was an outgrowth of that. Now, I'm going to link to all this stuff in the show notes. We publish a blog post a couple of hours after the live stream is done for every single episode. Alan Mosley does all the awesome work of organizing that blog post, and there will be a section at the top of it over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. There's a section at the top where there's an audio player on all the different audio podcast platforms. Then we have a video player and then all the video platforms. And then there's a show link section. Just scroll down a little bit if you're trying to do some research and reading, because the show link section will have all the original source documents, articles, everything that I'm referencing in this episode. Well, probably everything-ish, unless I kind of go off the reservation from my notes here. But basically, all the stuff that I'm mentioning will be there so you can read it in context and learn more on your own time. That's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. While I'm here, I want to say a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat. I appreciate you being here, Senator DT. I appreciate your message the other day, your email. And yes, we are working on getting things a little bit more stable, so I really appreciate you reaching out. Cheriton Farmer, Dixie Strong, Gregory Bradford, King Nobody, Sonny Bono. The Poor Man's Machine Gun is a pretty awesome screen name in Indiana. Good to see you, Liberty Revolutionary. There's Haji, Dan Reed, Crew Chief, 12-Pack, and everyone else. I appreciate you guys being here. Again, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. But let's get back to it. Again, the show notes for this blog will be published at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty in a couple of hours. Here's Samuel Adams talking about this. We can see this kind of transition from, well, everything will be fine as long as you repeal the Stamp Act, because we know you won't use this power in all cases whatsoever because you haven't used it elsewhere. And John Dickinson, of course, in his Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, he ended up being, he's probably we could call him the father of the Articles of Confederation. He was the primary drafter of that after independence was declared, but certainly he recognized that what he called the detestable precedent, once you establish that, now he actually talked about that in 1765 against the Stamp Act, once you establish the detestable precedent, they will always use it to expand that power and do more and more and more. And that's exactly what we have today, because as long as people allow them to establish these precedents, we shouldn't be surprised when nasty people get in power and use it in, well, Anyways, Samuel Adams, in the report to the town of Boston, March of 1773, he says, it appears to us impossible to be shown that the Parliament of Great Britain can exercise the powers of legislation for the colonists in all cases whatever, consistently with the rights which belong to the colonists as men, as Christians, and as subjects, or without destroying the foundation of their own constitution. So again, the same thing today. If federal law is always supreme until the federal government tells us that, oh, sorry, we made a mistake, then they have unlimited power over themselves, and we are just on our knees begging for permission. So unless the people, as Samuel Adams said, all might be free if they valued freedom and defended it as they ought, unless the people are willing to take a stand for freedom and exercise their rights, whether they get permission from government or not, it's not going to change. Here's Samuel Adams again in October of 1773. This is a letter to Joseph Hawley. He said, by assuming the power of making laws for America in all cases, and he put that in all caps as well, which is fascinating, at the time when the Stamp Act was repealed, it was probably their design to secure, as far as they could do it by an act of their own, this particular right of taxation, thinking at the same time that if they could once establish the precedent in an instance of so much importance to us as that of taking our money from us, they should thenceforward find it very easy to exercise their pretended right in every other case. Now, I haven't seen in Samuel Adams's writings, and there isn't a ton of it saved. He wasn't like a Thomas Jefferson who was basically saving everything he had to say for posterity. But there certainly wasn't anything that I found where he was really railing against the Declaratory Act as it first came out. Now, John Adams was writing some hints about it, like, oh, I wonder how they're going to use it. Certainly, they were probably talking about this at the time. But where you really see him going to town on this, that pun is intended, is in the 1770s or so, pointing out, like, look, they certainly passed this. Now they're using it. We can see them by 1773, of course, using it in many ways. We're standing armies, and then we get to the massacre and, of course, the Tea Party and the coercive acts in the following year. But he's recognizing that, look, maybe this was the whole design all along. Once you establish that precedent, and then if we give way on the tax, then they're going to use it in other ways. And that should be our lesson for today. We should never turn a blind eye to an exercise of power that violates our rights, and maybe that's redundant or an oxymoron, but we should never turn a blind eye to it, maybe because it's too small. And in fact, John Dickinson, in those letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania, was talking to some of the people who were saying, well, the Townsend duties aren't that big of a deal. And he said, that's a fatal error. If you ignore it because it's so small, those are the ones that really take a foothold, because you get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you get 10 of these small moves, attacks on your liberty, small precedents. That's the same as one big one. And the one big one is generally the ones that find more opposition by the people. Anyways, Richard Henry Lee writes to Samuel Adams later in October of 1773, pointing out this big shift. And I keep talking about how there was a shift in the viewpoints of the people, especially when it comes to sovereignty. And here's how Richard Henry Lee put it to Samuel Adams. Every day gives us new light and new strength. At first, it was a tender point to question the authority of Parliament over us in any case whatsoever. So there was this kind of subservience, I guess. They had all been raised under the notion that, well, yes, they do have this power in certain areas. And so they were kind of cautious about just even questioning that. It was a tender point to question the authority of Parliament over us in any case whatsoever. But by 1773, Richard Henry Lee is noting, well, now we're questioning it in every situation. And that's how he put it. Time and you, Samuel Adams, have proved that their right is equally questionable in all cases whatsoever. And I think that should be kind of a silver lining for us today. So many times when we're talking about one issue or another, some kind of federal or state or local program that's attacking someone's liberty, We all, it's so easy to do some whataboutism. Oh, this person might, sure, okay, they sound good on this, but what about this terrible position they did on that? And rather than saying, well, this is an opportunity to open eyes, as Richard Henry Lee, we are only questioning this power at first, but now we're questioning all of them. It at least is the door is open, and it's really incumbent upon us to keep pressing forward for more. So here's John Hancock in his Massacre Day oration, which I've covered a number of times on this show. He's pointing out again, John Hancock is pointing out in March of 1774 that the Declaratory Act is the root cause of all the problems. A claim of unlimited power is the source of the problem, and the taxation without representation is an outgrowth of that. He said, they have declared that they have ever had, and of right ought ever to have, full power to make laws of sufficient validity to bind the colonies in all cases whatever. They have exercised this pretended right by imposing a tax upon us without our consent. And lest we should show some reluctance at parting with our property, her fleets and armies are sent to enforce their mad pretensions. So they're shutting everything down. They're sending armies. They've got fleets, and they're making it very clear that they have power in all cases whatsoever, and they are willing to kill you over it. And of course, all government power is at the end of the barrel of a gun. Now, the first paragraph of the Declaration and Resolves of the First Continental Congress. This is another precursor to the Declaration of Independence. This is October of 1774. This was in response to the coercive acts, what we call the intolerable acts incorrectly many times today. They also cited the Declaratory Act of 1766, number one, literally the first paragraph, and then said that everything else that was happening, all the problems that they were facing, were an outgrowth of that claim to unlimited power. If you don't strike the root, if you just hack at branches, the branches often grow back stronger and worse, especially when you're talking about government power. And here it is, Declaration and Resolves of the First Continental Congress, October 14th, 1774. Whereas, since the close of the last war, the British Parliament, claiming a power of right to bind the people of America by statutes in all cases whatsoever, hath, in some acts, expressly imposed taxes on them, and in others, under various pretenses, but in fact for the purpose of raising a revenue, hath imposed rates and duties payable in these colonies, etc., etc., etc. And then they go through a list of all kinds of stuff that they're having issues with. And again, it all starts from the idea of unlimited centralized power. Even a young Alexander Hamilton took the same view. In December of 1774, he's defending the actions of the First Continental Congress in law. He says, what then is the subject of our controversy with the mother country? What is the cause of the controversy between the colonies and Great Britain? It's this notion of sovereignty and total control. And Hamilton answers it. What can actuate those men who labor to delude any of us into an opinion that the object of contention between the parent state and the colonies is only 3d duty upon tea? Is the tea tax of 3d really what we're going crazy about here? This is not the problem. This is an outgrowth of it. He said the Parliament claims the right to tax us in all cases whatsoever. Now, Hamilton, being Hamilton, of course, addresses this in the most narrow way possible. And there certainly were people in probably the House of Commons who were saying, yeah, we're only asserting this over taxation. But certainly they didn't limit it to that in the text. And then they said anyone who even questions that, all their actions are null and void. So Hamilton is getting the narrow view about taxation only. He said its late acts are in virtue of that claim. How ridiculous then is it to affirm that we are quarreling for the trifling sum of 3d a pound on tea, when it is evidently the principle against which we contend. So by December of 1774, even Alexander Hamilton is pointing out, look, the principle of unlimited centralized power is the problem. So if we want to think about principles of liberty, we have to start by thinking, well, centralized power is the problem. Decentralize, decentralize, decentralize. Now, here's Benjamin Franklin. I'm not sure when he made the transition, but certainly in 1766, he actually made the case to Parliament that, yeah, this is a good strategy. If you think politically you can't just repeal the Stamp Act in response to the resistance, make sure you repeal it. They'll be cool with that. And then if you need to, just to save face, because a lot of people, that's what they're saying they were doing, But John Adams, of course, is wondering right off the bat, like, what are they going to do with this stuff? If you need to save face, go for it. No one's going to have a problem with this. Well, he was certainly wrong about that. And then over time, he definitely shifted. And in a letter to Joseph Galloway, he discussed this. This is in February of 1775. Of course, by July, I can't remember the exact date, but Benjamin Franklin actually drafted the first Articles of Confederation proposal a year before the Declaration of Independence. So sometime between this point and the Declaration of Causes, which I'll get to in just a moment. But Galloway was in the Continental Congress, and he was one of the most prominent and staunch loyalists in America. He eventually joined up with the British and became a top advisor to the Commander-in-Chief of America, General Howe. But he had a plan for a union. He was hoping to resolve the conflict that hadn't turned into a shooting war in early 1775, and he was hoping to resolve this by a plan of union between the colonies and Great Britain. And in response, Franklin said, like, look, okay, we can consider this. Of course, he had proposed a plan all the way back in 1754, the Albany Plan of Union he was very influential with, that was kind of similar. But here's how he put it. But should that plan be again brought forward, I imagine that before establishing the Union, it would be necessary to agree on the following preliminary articles. So the number one thing that Benjamin Franklin has learned, the number one thing that they have to do before we can resolve any problems with Great Britain, number one, the Declaratory Act of Parliament to be repealed. Number two, all acts of Parliament or parts of acts laying duties on the colonies be repealed. But the number one thing Benjamin Franklin learned, and here's a great example of, okay, you might take kind of a milquetoast approach on something today, but at least when people do that, we can have a chance of helping them see the light and moving more towards liberty year in and year out. That's what my work is all about, of course, here as well. So Franklin is recognizing this. And then Thomas Jefferson and John Dickinson worked together to draft the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms, which was passed unanimously by the Second Continental Congress on July 6, 1775. They're explaining why they're fighting back. Of course, there's Lexington and Concord, and they actually offered, the British offered, give up your guns, give up your friends, Samuel Adams and John Hancock, and everyone can get a pardon. And they said, no deal. And they said, well, this is why there actually is physical fighting. And they said, why should we enumerate our injuries in detail? They're not even going to give a list of grievances. They said, by one statute, it is declared that Parliament can of right make laws to bind us in all cases whatsoever. What is to defend us against so enormous, so unlimited a power? And Thomas Jefferson's earlier draft, John Dickinson kind of moderated the tone on a lot of what Jefferson had to say on this, but they definitely worked together on it. His fair copy earlier draft, over the previous couple of weeks, I have a date of June 26, 1775. This is how Jefferson put it originally. By one act, they have suspended the powers of one American legislature, and by another have declared that they may legislate for us themselves in all cases whatsoever. These two acts alone form a basis broad enough whereon to erect a despotism of unlimited extent. And Jefferson, of course, he had the exact same views in 1798 when he was responding to John Adams's hated Alien and Sedition Acts. This is a great example. You can see how all these people are a great example of don't trust anyone with power, including the people who tell you don't trust anyone with power. Because when Jefferson was in office, he did stuff he wasn't supposed to do. When John Adams was in office, he did stuff he wasn't supposed to do. But at certain times, they did great things. So we want to learn from the good, and we also want to learn from the bad as not the maxim of never trusting any human being with power. But here's Jefferson pointing out this is unlimited extent. And he wrote in his response, the Kentucky resolutions against the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798, that the several states are not united on a principle of unlimited submission to their general government. So there is no situation where anyone can be free when government has the final say over itself. Now, in the harsh winter of 1776, Thomas Paine, after starting off his great "These are the times that try men's souls," this is the American crisis #1. Legend has it that George Washington had it read to the troops as a motivator for them to keep pushing on no matter how difficult the odds are. Well, here's how he wrapped up the first paragraph. Britain, with an army to enforce her tyranny, has declared that she has a right not only to tax, but to bind us in all cases whatsoever. And if being bound in that manner is not slavery, then there is not such a thing as slavery upon earth. Even the expression is impious, for so unlimited a power can belong only to God. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. More important than anything, I hope you learned something. Mike Meharry wraps it up with this great line. Over and over again, the old revolutionaries railed against this claim of unlimited centralized power. They rejected it, and they were willing to put it all on the line to stop it. And nothing helps us get this kind of information out to more and more people more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat that they keep devaluing to establish their empire both abroad and at home, throw it our way. Our membership program over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members starts out at just $2 a month. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I appreciate any consideration you can give to joining us today, but, if you can't do it, there's a lot of things that you can do to help us spread the word, like smashing the like button, leaving reviews on podcast platforms like Apple Podcasts, sharing links, subscribing, getting notifications. All these things can potentially help trigger algorithms, especially of the mainstream platforms, and then they show us to more and more people. Let me take a look over in the chat and see if there's any comments or questions. Lewis starts as bold in 2024. Never know. Even when I go to Washington, D.C., sure, I live in Southern California, but I'm as far away from Washington, D.C. as possible. I had family that grew up there, and I go and I just want to wash when I leave. But thanks, Lewis. That's pretty fun. Alan Mosley says, please give us loot. Thank you. Alan's awesome. So Alan will be getting this blog post done in the next couple of hours, and then I will get it published over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Sean Strike, although 10th Amendment Center are good peeps, I share them with fellow researchers. I appreciate that as well. And see what else I've got. Jefferson was on point in this quote about unlimited power, and certainly that was a recurring theme. And again, I think it's very important. It's so easy to say, oh, and we hear this from leftists all the time. They always use a straw man argument. They always use ad hominem attacks. Don't listen to Thomas Jefferson because he did this was bad. He was a slave owner, so we can't listen to anything he did. So-and-so was a racist, but everyone was a racist at that point. Are we supposed to ignore all of our history because someone who said something good also did something bad? To me, that is just rejecting the growth of human knowledge. And if we reject that, then, well, we're always starting fresh. And maybe that's what the Marxist revolutionaries want us for. Anyways, I'm going to take a look a little bit further in the comments, both on the live comments or also in the archive a little bit later today. I appreciate all the feedback. Again, it helps us trigger algorithms and we reach more people the more you engage with the content. But it also gives me a lot of ideas for future episodes. I appreciate your feedback. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members if you'd like to join us and help us financially. 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty is where you're going to find the show notes in a couple of hours. I hope you had an awesome weekend. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope to see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.